Welcome to the FML Podcast, the podcast on a mission to uncover actionable insights, explore the latest trends, and to catalyze your fintech's growth. Join Growth Gorilla's founder and managing director, Shameer Sachdev, and some of fintech's hardest-hitting marketers and leaders.
Welcome everyone to today's episode of the FML Podcast. Today we're joined by Thea Sokolowski, Head of Marketing at Stitch. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to sort of tell the audience who you are, what you do, and about your journey to Stitch so far?
So I'm Thea. I'm originally from the US. I went to school in New York and started my career in New York in the marketing space. So I worked for a few different kind of advertising and branding agencies, which is how I got my start. And about 3 years in, I had a friend from undergrad who was working at this really interesting organization based in Ghana called MEST Africa. And MEST is actually the nonprofit arm of a software company called Meltwater. It's a global software company. MEST is a training program for people that are aspiring to be tech entrepreneurs on the African continent. So it's a sort of one-year training program, and then at the end, some of the sort of businesses that are formed there get funding and go into an incubator where they help them to grow their business. So my friend was working there. They were looking for business teaching fellows for the program, and he's like, "Hey, you should really check this out." In about 3 weeks, I interviewed, got the job, quit my job in New York, and moved to Ghana, and it was an absolutely amazing experience. Got to work with that year, probably 50 different entrepreneurs building businesses of all kinds across numerous markets in Africa. And it was very much a learning through the fire hose experience. So sort of helped them develop their narratives, their go-to-market strategies, while learning about how to do so in markets that were very different from the one that I was coming from. So I did that for a year, ended up in business school in the UK, and spent a year after that in San Francisco, just kind of learning at the tech center of the world. And realized that I really missed working on the continent. So actually came back to MEST as well as its parent company, Meltwater, for a few years. I was working closely with the CEO who had written a book and was sort of launching what was essentially a new division of Meltwater at the time. And so I kind of split my time for a few years between London, working at Meltwater, and MEST. And in that time, helped them launch incubators across Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. And then following that, actually moved to a different accelerator that was then focused on fintech startups, specifically in the inclusive space. So startups targeting individuals that are lower income in emerging markets. So worked there for 2 years and now moved over back to the startup side and the builder side. And now I'm leading marketing and communications at Stitch.
Cool. How long have you been at Stitch for?
So I joined in October last year, so a little less than a year.
Cool. So do you want to tell us a little bit about Stitch, who they are, what they do?
Yeah, so Stitch is headquartered in South Africa. So we operate in South Africa and Nigeria, and we're a payments and financial data API. So what we do is make it easier for fintech businesses or e-commerce businesses who need access to users' bank accounts to connect to those bank accounts and either access financial data to kind of view their financial behavior, their transaction history, or primarily to make payments. So we enable businesses to accept what we call instant EFT payments in South Africa and also enable payouts and disbursements.
From my background, very, very sort of used to doing marketing in across Europe, UK, US. How's the landscape different out in Africa versus, I suppose, what a lot of our audience is probably used to seeing in the Western world, really?
It's quite different. One of the first things to sort of remember is that Africa is composed of 54 countries, which are very, very different. Very different in terms of culture, in terms of currency, in terms of regulation, legal hurdles, languages. So there's sort of a lot that differs across markets there. And I think that's actually one of the reasons Stitch was created. So, the founders sort of had this vision of what if it was possible to create infrastructure where if you want to launch a fintech business in one African market and then expand and scale into new markets, you didn't have to sort of jump over all of those kind of regulatory hurdles each time. You didn't need to integrate with completely different set of banks every time. You could just integrate with something like Stitch that's already done that work for you. That's definitely one of the biggest hurdles. One of the other things is, of course, technology and sort of financial literacy also differs quite a lot across markets. So for example, we're live in South Africa and Nigeria. South Africa is quite a heavily banked population in comparison to other markets in Africa. Something close to, between 70 and 80% of people have a bank account. But the majority of users that have that bank account kind of receive funding into it and instantly withdraw it in cash and use that cash to make payments in markets. So the sort of digital element is definitely still growing. But other markets like Kenya, actually, which is where I'm based, around 80% of the population has access to mobile money, which is a really interesting innovation, particularly in East Africa and other emerging markets. So, financial inclusion rates are kind of high, but it operates very differently than, say, a bank account does. And so these are the sorts of things that you sort of have to keep in mind when you're delivering products to these various markets.
It's interesting to talk about sort of mobile banking there. I think is it M-Pesa in Kenya? That's
yeah.
It was a ridiculous statistic, like something like 80 or 90% of the country's GDP goes through their network, and it's basically the country's built around it, right? So I think it's starting to move into Tanzania and countries around it.
Exactly.
Noting the number of countries, the regulatory hurdles, and all of those things that you mentioned, on the ground, what does that look like from, obviously Stitch being a B2B solution, what does that look like from a B2B marketing play in that case then? How do you get in front of your target audience, your ideal customers?
Yeah, so in South Africa, I think, payments generally tends to be quite a significant hurdle for any business getting off the ground. So, previously, if you were launching any sort of fintech business or business that needed to accept digital payments, you'd have to go and form a relationship with and integrate with every single bank that you need to accept payments from individually. And so not only does that require you to kind of have a relationship with them, but it's very complicated from a technical perspective as well. And so what that does is actually limit the number of businesses that are able to reach that point and get off the ground. Our goal is to make it easier for those businesses to launch their products, to scale into new markets, to offer more services to their users. The way that we approached it was kind of looking at first those fintechs. So businesses like ChipperCash, which has become quite popular globally. They're one of our clients in South Africa, so they have a P2P wallet system. So they use Stitch to enable their users to send payments back, to load money into their wallets so they can send payments to one another. What we do is also kind of minimize fraud. So fraud is quite a significant challenge as well in these markets, as it is everywhere, but in particular here, where a lot of these digital payments, the regulation is still kind of catching up. So you have these issues where, for example, particularly in the crypto space in South Africa, oftentimes what happens is a bank might flag a payment made to a crypto company as fraud. But because a crypto company has to ensure, the funding for their users as quickly as possible so they can get the best rates, they may provide that funding to the user's wallet and then a couple of days later get blocked by that bank, in which case they're out that funding, right? Solution like ours that enables payments to happen instantly, that enables a reconciliation to happen, kind of removes that fraud element. And so that, along with lower fees versus card payments, for example, which in South Africa can be upwards of 2 to 3%, are big selling points for a lot of our users. And so kind of approaching these fintechs and these kind of e-commerce companies, these PSPs with that sort of value proposition was really interesting in South Africa, especially as the concept of this sort of bank-to-bank payment, instant EFT system is starting to gain traction.
In the UK, in Europe, in the US, if a B2B company is trying to reach out to other enterprise sort of businesses to try and sell in a relatively complex solution, a lot of it's business dev, a lot of it's account-based marketing, perhaps, maybe even some form of demand generation. Is that fundamentally the tactics that you're using for Stitch, or does it differ at all, or are there any nuances that make it quite different because of the region?
So before I joined in October, so we launched in February 2021 is when Stitch came out of stealth. There wasn't a marketing team at all. There wasn't much marketing going on. So it was, very much our amazing biz dev team kind of reaching out to these businesses. We actually launched with the financial data solution first. So we got a lot of businesses on board who needed, for instance, if you're a lending company and you need to evaluate someone's affordability, you want to access their bank accounts to make that process digital and a lot easier than their manual processes. Our initial customers kind of came in that way. And as we developed our payment solutions, we're able to sort of, once we have their trust, upsell them on that. Some of the bigger accounts that we had obviously created great case studies where we can use those brands to then, reach out to others and show that there were businesses that trusted us. Now that we're sort of up and running there, one of the biggest things that we're looking at is really channel partners. So recognizing there are businesses and payments platforms that can actually on-sell the Stitch solution where we don't necessarily have brand awareness or brand recognition. So I think, the approach we're taking is our brand doesn't necessarily come first. So obviously recognizing that the businesses we're working with have trust with their end users. And so what we really want to push is our payment solution and, having their end users sort of leverage that. So now a lot of the approaches that we're taking is as a client goes live, like making sure that we're, sharing with the wider industry and the press that we're working with these brands to sort of make that statement in the market, but also making sure that we're kind of going above and beyond with every client that goes live with us to make sure that their sort of UI UX in the way that Stitch is integrated makes sense to their users and is sort of optimized to promote that payment method. And then also to provide them with like guidance in terms of, introducing this new payment method to their users, making sure they understand the benefits of it, making sure they understand they can trust it, and then helping and working with them on sort of promotions to incentivize people to continue to choose it. And so as more of those clients kind of roll out and more of their end users sort of start to become familiar with this as a payment method, obviously that helps us with future business development as well.
You said that it's more product first than brand. Is there a point at which you'll start to sort of push the brand further than the product? Is there an intention around that, or are you quite happy? Is the senior management team quite happy to just focus on channel partners and almost reselling to a degree?
Yeah, it's an interesting one and a conversation actually we've been having with quite a few of our investors. So we're actually really fortunate to be backed by some of the founders and like early builders at some of the biggest global fintech companies like TrueLayer and Venmo and Plaid and Stripe. And so we've had a lot of chats with people from those organizations who have kind of seen how this plays out. I think the reality is it's very, very difficult to build a consumer-facing brand as a payments company. So if you look at people who have done that well, it's your Visas and your MasterCards and your PayPals, who obviously have a lot of money that they can spend toward consumer-facing marketing efforts. Realistically, all we need is for a consumer to trust our payment method and the brand or the application or platform that they're using, right, when they're exposed to that payment method. And so for us, what we're trying to do is get our customers and users familiar with the concept of what we call linking an account. So essentially, like Stitch's payments product, it's called LinkPay. And what makes it different is we're the first in Africa to actually tokenize a user's account. So it's the same way, like if you link your credit card to an app or a platform or an e-commerce site and it remembers that credit card number, we do that with bank accounts. This is obviously a new concept for everybody, but especially in African markets. And so what we're trying to do is work with our clients to help customers understand this concept of linking and getting linked to their platform and getting familiar with that and building trust in that, so that when they see, okay, link an account across, multiple different brands and multiple different sites, that's what resonates with them. Versus the Stitch brand, which right now, doesn't mean much to an end user. And we have to put a lot of marketing time and effort into building that up.
So just talking about getting the user familiar with linking their accounts. Obviously, that's education. How are you going about doing that and actually reaching the end user and building that education?
Yeah, so we work very, very closely with all the clients that go live with Stitch. So to give a little perspective for anybody that works in B2B space or API space, when you sort of sell a client on, it starts with signing to say, okay, yes, we're going to use this payment method. But then the integration phase can take anywhere from, a few days to even a few months, depending on the size of the organization. And so we very much white glove support all of our clients through that process. So we have, first an onboarding team that helps them with the technical components. But we've very much realized that, okay, building the actual technical integration of this is only one piece of it. So I was saying, so the UI UX piece is actually like really, really significant. and making sure that like even the small things like, putting our payment method first on the list of different options that customers have really makes a difference for customers to sort of choose that. Making sure that, they're calling the method the same thing across all clients, to make sure that there's like a line of descriptor copy essentially that introduces, okay, you can link an account and that will enable you to make payments in one click. We work with the top 5 banks across South Africa, which gives us something like 98% coverage. But just in case for anybody who doesn't have those banks, we also make sure that we're, we kind of show a customer which banks are available before they choose that method so that they also don't get frustrated if they don't see their bank and things like that. So we work very closely with them throughout the onboarding process to make sure that their UI UX is as optimal as possible. And that's sort of that first step, because often that's the first time a customer will see this payment method. But then also making sure that when they're preparing to roll this method out to users, and users will see it for the first time in their app or platform, that we also give them a bunch of suggested sort of marketing copy and language and like assets that they can use. So we recommend that they, for instance, email customers the day that the Stitch payment method is live in their platform to say, hey, we've got a new way for you to pay. This is what it is. This is why you can trust it. This is why you've chosen to partner with them. And also making sure that they sort of do that across all communications channels that they have with their customers. And like I said, we actually like write suggested copy for that, just to make sure that the language they're using is consistent. And then we continue to work with clients once they go live. So, it obviously doesn't stop there. Like we want to increase activation among end users, who are using our clients' products. I've gone through some like kind of incentivization campaigns with some clients. We've sparred like kind of co-marketing initiatives we could do. We often do like industry-facing press releases, which consumers will also see to kind of demonstrate our partnership. So there's a lot of different kind of levers that you can pull there. But really at this stage, especially, we're only a 1.5-year old company. It's definitely a lot of like white glove hand-holding with our clients. And I think also interesting from a PSP perspective. So sometimes it's like business to merchants to end user, right? And so it's also kind of looking at like that whole value chain to make sure that the merchant also understands, what they're getting out of it. For instance, paying lower fees on the transactions, or potentially incentivizing certain merchants to push it to their end users as well. So kind of playing with different levers there.
What have been the major sort of, I suppose, challenges with launching Stitch that you've sort of run into and faced?
The main one, and this is what we're trying to tackle with a lot of this like kind of co-marketing work with clients, is a trust factor, right? So this is a new payment method. It does require that users log into their bank accounts through our platform. And so obviously this is not something most people are used to. And also, a lot of times like people may not have internet banking credentials actually. And so just making sure that we're like prepared to answer any sort of like user queries and prepare our clients to answer any sort of user queries. So now we're recommending, for instance, that when they launch, they have FAQ and help articles on their website, or that we provide a script, for instance, to their support team, like their call center, so that if people reach out with questions or concerns, they have, the language that to help them with that. So that sort of all those efforts around building trust have been something we've been experimenting with. I think in Nigeria, it's particularly acute because there's quite a lot of fraud in Nigeria. And what's actually really fascinating is how sophisticated every consumer is in Nigeria when it comes to fintech and their finances. We've done user research with, everyone from like a student to, a teacher to someone who actually works in the tech space. Everyone is kind of able to articulate what does encrypted data mean, what happens when I enter my banking details on web, like they can be stolen, my bank account can be hacked. And so they're kind of like definitely aware of all of these things. And so it's made us have to kind of step back and relook at our flow and think, okay, what are all the ways in which we can kind of reinforce and reconfirm to users about trust? And I think, interestingly, one of those things has actually been, I think there's a word for this, but like adding a little bit more positive friction, I think is the term, in the flow, which may be counterintuitive, but things like, multi-factor authentication, having to enter an OTP, like all of those things really reinforce that this is a trustworthy platform, especially for those users. So like adding steps to make them aware of the fact that that's coming and that's something they will be asked for, kind of, for example, helps to build that trust a bit more. But that's been a significant challenge.
I was just thinking about your point around the Nigerian market, how educated there are. And I was thinking, actually, there's probably, although a challenge, it's actually quite positive because they're educated, they've got that awareness there, as opposed to a territory that doesn't have that knowledge at all. You have to educate them from the ground up at that point, which I suppose, arguably would make it a lot more expensive to launch into that sort of territory and almost a no-go for the time being.
Yeah, it's true. I guess learning about those different behaviors is really fascinating as well. I think Nigeria in particular had a lot of innovation around like digital banks and neobanks in the last few years, particularly because of this fraud challenge, and also because banks often, for instance, charge fees every time you make a transaction, but a large percentage of the population is banked and often uses like bank transfer as a payment method versus card, for instance. And so, a lot of the people we spoke with, they might have a bank account or two or three with several different banks, and they may use, say, one of those accounts, they may keep like a small amount of money in and say, okay, this is what I'm going to use to make online purchases, because if this gets hacked, I'm not really mad because there's not much in it, right? Whereas they might use one of the neobanks like Kuda or OPay to make their more consistent transactions, because A, they know that they can make a certain amount per month without getting charged a fee, and B, there's like a certain level of trust there. So those sorts of behaviors are things that you really need to understand before entering the market to know how to sort of navigate that.
So you mentioned obviously that you're in South Africa and Nigeria. I'm guessing the intention is to be across as many of those 54 countries in Africa. Have you kind of got a rollout plan as to how you're going to tackle that, or is that yet to still be defined?
Yeah, definitely still in development. I think we have a good idea of some of the markets that make sense next. Egypt is one of the higher banked markets as well, and really coming into its own in terms of like digital transactions. I think, Kenya is obviously interesting, Ghana, but at the moment, we're really focused actually on rolling out more of our payment solutions in our existing markets and sort of really nailing that first. I think there's still a ton of opportunity in South Africa to fulfill a lot of the needs that businesses we're working with have. So at the moment, we're sort of doubling down on that and increasing our presence there. And then, we'll look to expand into new markets in the next few years for sure.
So switching streams a little bit, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as to the importance and the role of fintech in opening up the African market.
One, I guess, way of looking at this is like VC funding recently coming into startups on the continent, and fintech is far and away the largest sector in terms of funding received across markets. And I think the reason for that is it's become such a foundation for, the ability to build anything else. I think we've all heard recently, everything is a fintech these days, and embedded finance is really kind of taking off in Africa as well as in other markets. And I think the reason is, I don't want to use the term leapfrogging, but, often in these markets, people's first encounter with digital finance might be a fintech app. So they might have a fintech app before they have a bank account. Like, for instance, that's, in Kenya, we talked about M-Pesa. Most people that use M-Pesa don't have a bank account. And so they're using this app or this fintech that's associated with this telecom as a first means of really experiencing what it is to have digital payments. And so once they have that capacity or capability, there's so many other like products and solutions that you can try to offer, right? So how do we move from just being able to make payments to being able to also save money? How do we move from being able to save money to now that you have a digital record of your transactions and your transaction history, accessing things like loans or, insurance? And so there kind of becomes this like endless array of innovation that can be layered on top of, the basic fintech infrastructure once that infrastructure exists. And so fintech has such an interesting role to play in like the daily lives of people here. If you think about all of these individuals that are in the process now of moving from very cash-based economies and cash-based living to really relying on digital payments or digital finances for the first time. It's super interesting to look at how that's evolved across markets. So for instance, I was saying in South Africa, a lot of people are banked. So that's quite different than anywhere else on the continent. But at the same time, credit is a huge problem in South Africa. So, as soon as people had access to bank accounts, there was a lot of people that came in and said, okay, I'm going to offer, fast access to credit for a population who didn't really have the sort of education around how to properly manage that credit and what that means. They're now in a situation where there's a lot of people that have significant debt. And so debt counseling and facilitating debt and helping people to get out of that is actually a significant industry in South Africa. And some of the clients we work with are doing amazing work to try to help some of those people, consolidate that and figure out how to get themselves to a better position. So that's become almost an industry on its own. And then there's off of that, there's, a lot of people developing safer, more affordable, more responsible ways for people to access, for instance, a salary advance, so they can get themselves through the month. And that comes in the form of a sort of fintech app. And that's making a big difference for people. But then in Kenya, because it's not bank accounts, it's mobile money. There's so many other things you can do on top of that, right? Because now I can, just by having access to my phone, I can go anywhere in the country to the most remote rural areas and be able to pay somebody just by asking for their phone number. And so, then what happens is that's possible because Safaricom, which is the telco that M-Pesa belongs to, they've got this really army of agents. And an agent is just someone who, is licensed, who can take someone's cash and put it into their M-Pesa account, for instance. So it almost works like an ATM or like a bank, but almost anyone can really become a Safaricom agent. So now you're leveraging these little, they're called dukas, so small shops where someone might sell, basic goods to someone, basic foods, can also be an M-Pesa agent. And then not only do they have an extra, source of income, but there's so many of them that it becomes so much more accessible to sort of the wider community. Once that's possible, have this person that acts like an ATM or a bank. So you can use that for things like savings, for things like lending. You can use it for things like e-commerce. And there's an awesome company out here called Copia. They use these sort of M-Pesa agents or duka shops as an address for people in the surrounding areas. So you think about trying to order something, you don't have an address in these areas, you can use your local shop as that address and get something delivered to you. So there's so many doors that become open once that sort of foundation of digital payments is possible.
Over the next few years, as fintech becomes more embedded into Africa, it feels like Africa's a little bit of it could be a bit of a dark horse in the sense that it could kind of come out from nowhere really and could become a real hub of activity, financial inclusivity and all the rest of it. One of the other areas that I wanted to explore is marketing channels that we kind of take for granted in the UK, in Europe, in America, in the Americas even, that we expect that we'll just use to drive growth in traffic. How commonplace are they in the African market?
It's really interesting because I think maybe particularly for B2C companies, I think B2B companies definitely still things like LinkedIn, et cetera, are very important channels. But I think for a lot of B2C companies, you think about, okay, I'm going to launch a Google ad and look at search terms. Well, in a lot of markets, people's primary way of accessing the internet is via mobile. And they have to pay for data. Data can be quite expensive. So often for the average consumer, they're not sitting on Google, Googling things. So it's not the most effective channel for reaching them. And in some markets, it's also really expensive to try to bid on some of these keywords. What's interesting is some of the social media companies have, deals with some of the telcos. So for instance, I think this is the case in Kenya, and it was a bit when I lived in Ghana. If I buy data and I use Facebook or I use WhatsApp, it actually doesn't cost me data to do that. And so actually, maybe this is something I should also clarify is here, there's not really cell phone plans. So I think you can in South Africa, but in a lot of markets, it's just pay as you go. It's just top up. So I'll just add money to my cell phone number and purchase a data bundle or airtime. And it could be for, a limited amount of days or without expiry, et cetera. But it's not like I have a contract where I pay a monthly bill and I have unlimited access to data. I have to pay for the data I consume. So for a lot of people, if there's a deal, okay, if I use Facebook and I use WhatsApp, I don't have to pay for data. That's going to become my primary means of searching for things or getting information, right? And I'm only going to use data if and when it's absolutely necessary. I'm also not going to spend data downloading a very heavy app and using that app, right? I'm very cautious about the number of apps that I might have on my phone. In some instances, obviously, there's also people that don't even have smartphones and can't access an app. So you have to be really creative about the ways that you're sort of trying to reach some of these populations. For a B2B business, it's a bit different. Obviously, yes, we use social media to some extent, and in South Africa, we can use Google Ads. But I think things like communities become really important here. We're trying to really facilitate the growth of our developer community. So looking at developers as advocates within the businesses that they work in, right? Also looking at like a lot of the sort of startup spaces and accelerators and things like that, since we're trying to reach like a startup and fintech audience. People may not expect that in these markets, the sort of channels that are tried and true that you can rely on just wouldn't kind of deliver the same results.
I definitely understand the search side of things. That makes absolute sense. I suppose with platforms like Facebook/Instagram, then I suppose, is that still a viable, I mean, I know predominantly B2B, but for B2C, do you think that's a viable channel for acquiring users out in those markets?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what's interesting is like social commerce is also huge out here. So oftentimes, small shops or, small businesses that sell items or sell clothing or, food, et cetera, Instagram and Twitter might be the primary place, or I would say primarily Instagram and Facebook might be the primary place where they acquire users. They often don't even have a website. So they'll have an Instagram account before they have a website and kind of manage their entire user communications through DM on Instagram, for instance. And so, yeah, like that's definitely a huge place. Like people are on social media, quite often. I think the way that you have to think about those ads and that positioning is a bit different than you would in other markets.
My second question around kind of what you said was you talked about developing communities. Just I want to understand the mechanics behind that. Is that online communities like Slack groups, things like that, or are you focusing on doing a little bit more sort of event-based type stuff to help foster those communities?
Yeah, I'd say definitely both. There are a number of Slack communities, but I would say, well, in Nigeria specifically, there's a huge developer community. A lot of people on Twitter that interact quite often. And there's like specific developer communities that are physical as well. And so there's a lot of like kind of co-working spaces and like hubs and things like that where people gather. But there's also a lot of like groups where people come to physical events. They'll have, newsletters, or they'll have WhatsApp groups or things like that. A lot of WhatsApp groups out here. And so what you want to do is kind of find those areas where your target audience is and where they get their information and where they interact. It depends on who you're trying to reach. So for us developers or product managers or early stage founders, there's a lot of like support or accelerator programs or things like that where people go and where you can access like large groups of them. I think if you're a B2C business, for instance, and you're trying to reach like low income individuals, there's a lot of kind of WhatsApp groups within communities that could be interesting. I remember often we would go, if we're trying to target, for instance, motorcycle taxi drivers out here, like you can go and find like communities where they meet up on like weekends or certain times of the month and access like a lot of them through one particular kind of leader influencer. And so it's just about like understanding the dynamics of how your target audience interacts with one another and how they seek and find information when they need it.
That's incredibly interesting. I love that sort of stuff, actually. It reminds me, this was years ago, I was speaking to the founder of Trezio, and they were trying to target, gig economy workers, and they found like this like little niche of like South American, I think like Uber drivers and Uber deliverers and delivery people and stuff like that. And the way they found it was that they just happened to have employed a Brazilian lad who was going around sort of doing a bit of like, I don't know, literally knocking on doors. And we kind of tapped into this community that was completely untouched, and it opened up a huge number of doors for them just by kind of like stumbling upon that. In terms of trying to get an indication of that landscape, is that something that you acquired through your experience of working in Africa and working at Stitch? Or did or was there actual research, on the ground research that you did to try and sort of uncover those findings? Or was it a bit of both?
Yeah, I mean, definitely both, but I think I was really fortunate. So where I was before Stitch was this accelerator called Catalyst Fund. And Catalyst Fund is essentially a project that's managed by a consulting firm called BFA Global. And BFA's focus is on like financial inclusion, digital finance, and emerging markets. I kind of managed marketing and communications for both BFA as well as Catalyst Fund. And what that meant is conducting and driving insights from research, a lot of end user research in these markets, but also working with all the startups that came through the accelerator program on their own marketing strategies, narratives, pitches, etc. So I was exposed to like a very significant amount of end user research and just like business models and tests and things over the course of those 2 years that really kind of opened my eyes to how this works. And like similarly, with my work at MEST before that, I think over whatever it was, my 3-4 years there, I was exposed to probably hundreds of business models of founders who came with a lot of market knowledge across different African markets. And so definitely like by working with them, got to see what works and what doesn't and learned a ton.
Cool. That's super interesting. This has been fascinating, and I could probably ask questions all day, to be honest with you. But we only have a limited amount of time. Yeah, let's jump into our quick fire round. What podcasts are you listening to at the moment?
One of my favorites is actually the 11FS Fintech marketing podcasts. They're a consulting firm up in the UK. Really awesome stuff. On the sort of business marketing side, on the other side, I'm a big fan of Dax Shepard's Armchair Expert podcast, actually.
What books are you reading at the moment, or would you recommend to our audience?
I just bought 2. So the Ministry for the Future, which is on, I think, like Bill Gates or Obama's recent recommended list, and The Power, and then Crossing the Chasm are 3 that I'm reading at the moment.
Crossing the Chasm, I've heard of that. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, it's Jeffrey Moore. It's like marketing and selling disruptive products is sort of the gist.
Noting that down. My wife literally just bought for me, actually I've got it literally on my desk, I haven't even started reading it yet, but it's the Ogilvy's Confession of an Advertising Man. We just done
That's a great one.
A binge of Mad Men, and I mentioned to her, that's actually a real book, and it arrived a few days later, which I thought was pretty cool.
Awesome.
What's your favourite fintech app other than Stitch?
Because I live in Kenya, I use my M-Pesa app absolutely every day. So that's definitely one. I think some of the international remittances apps just are so helpful for someone like myself who, lives in a different country from where I'm from. So things like Sendwave and like Chipper Cash, very helpful for kind of moving money across borders, which is awesome. Investing. So I actually love Ellevest in the US, which is specifically focused on enabling women to make longer term investments. So I use them and Robinhood for investments as well.
And kind of finishing the fintech streak a little bit, who from like the world of fintech or even startups in general would you most like to go for lunch with?
I'm not sure. So what's cool is like I was saying, a lot of our investors are like these early builders at some of like the biggest fintech apps. And like I've actually had amazing opportunity to sit down with a lot of them and just like fire questions like this. Like, how did you do this? How did you get out of this? And that's been like amazingly helpful. So if we were to think about like some of the biggest original fintech apps, like your PayPals and your Venmos, I think like some of the early builders at those, even the guys from M-Pesa, like would just love to sort of hear more about how they've done it. I think we've all heard like the public version of those stories, but as we all know, there's a lot more behind those doors. So,
kind of getting introspective now. What's the best bit of life advice you've ever received?
For me, it's always been about having perspective, and I think like that can be interpreted in a lot of ways. So one of which is just like empathy. So if you always are able to, in any sort of situation, like back up and look at the perspective or how this is perceived by the others involved in that situation or others outside of that situation, and just like always approaching everything with empathy, you'll find that you don't get as stressed, angry, whatever emotion you were feeling, and B, you're able to come to a conclusion that often kind of benefits more parties or as many parties as possible. So just like always kind of reminding yourself, even when you get bogged down, to just like back up and always try to see things from other people's perspectives.
And my last and probably favorite question, what's one thing I haven't asked that you felt I should have asked?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the solutions that would be similar are things like Plaid in the US, Stripe, TrueLayer in the UK, Go Cardless, those types of solutions. And I think, the way that we always looked at it was, if you go back and look at, when Plaid really started to sort of gain momentum and have a larger user base, there's a significant increase in the rate at which new fintechs were able to launch and scale and get started in the US market. And so that's sort of how we see, or we hope, like it will play out with Stitch, where, once that infrastructure exists and people are able to plug into it, we'll actually see a lot more innovation happening, a lot more companies being able to get off the ground. And sort of that's how we see that infrastructure. I think the challenge is, whereas Plaid had to deal with, regulations and challenges and, differences across maybe 50 states that shared in some ways similar regulation, even though a lot of different banks. In Africa, it's just like completely different across each market. And so it comes with, all sorts of new layers and challenges and things that you have to sort of think about. So our path is definitely a bit more challenging, but hopefully have the same outcomes.
That's awesome. That was really insightful and really enjoyable. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to chat.
The FML Podcast is brought to you by Growth Gorilla. To find out how our marketing growth experts can boost your fintech's growth, head to growthgorilla.co.uk. And make sure to search for the FML Podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Don't forget to click follow to ensure you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Growth Gorilla, thanks for listening.